most of the issues are like very, very important things that we need to address.
The threat that was happening to the West Virginia IDD waiver.
We passed our budget. We felt good about it. The budget got to the Senate, and the Senate inserted their version into our version, which was vastly different. Cut 10% of the Department of Human Services budget completely and gutted IDD waiver. It really creates a lot of unrest and a lot of uncertainty for families that rely on these programs. Yeah.
Mental health and well-being that really goes back to the basis of our entire nonprofit. And without that waiver, most of us would have a really, really difficult time, more than we already have.
Money people are relying on and have been receiving for a long time is now just a big question mark, and it's scary.
Welcome back to another episode of Get UnPuzzled, the podcast where we break down barriers, connect families, and bring real conversations to the autism and disability community. I'm your host, Whitney Price, and today we have a truly inspiring guest joining us. Delegate Kayla Young has been a strong advocate for individuals with disabilities, playing a key role in supporting the West Virginia IDD waiver and pushing for policies that make a real difference in the lives of families like ours. She's here to talk about the impact that she's had, the changes she's fought for, and most importantly, how we can make our voices heard in the legislative process. If you've ever wondered how to effectively advocate for change, then this episode is for you. Let's dive in. Thank you. Thank you a ton for joining us. Really appreciate everything that you're doing for our community. And
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey into politics and what inspired you into becoming a delegate?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in the government kind of from afar, and it never personally really affected me until 2016, and I was worried about reproductive freedom. The first time that I was really concerned was, I guess, in 2013, when my son was born. I am in Kanawha County in Charleston. My son was born in early January during a snowstorm. And a few days after he was born, we had the water crisis and we didn't have access to clean water. And so he didn't have a bath in a bathtub for almost a year because I was scared about the water. And so that got me interested in like, well, what's going on here? And then after 2016, I was worried about my own reproductive freedom, and I had a daughter born after that. So I was, a little worried about what reality was going to look like for us moving forward in the world. And so I started getting more involved in politics and just kind of started learning and paying attention. Then I had an opportunity to become a lobbyist for an environmental organization. So I always tell everybody we were really used to losing because we, in a state like West Virginia and you're lobbying for renewable energy, it wasn't very popular at the time when I was doing it in 2018, 19, 20. And so once I started doing that, I got into the legislature and like watching the committee meetings as an advocate and realizing kind of how the process worked. That's really where I understood the process and how it all went through. And I started seeing some of the legislators, and I was just sitting there and I was like, these are just regular people. Like these aren't fancy people. They don't know more than I know. Some of them do, but like for the most part, they're just kind of all over the place. Like, oh, there's a truck driver. Oh, there's a doctor, there's a lawyer, there's a stay-at-home mom. Like the background is endless, which is great. And so I was like, man, I could do this. And so then I decided to run for office. And luckily, my first election was in 2020. It ended up being the pandemic, which was wild. And so I ran for office and won. And that was 5 years ago now.
That's amazing. And what are some of the biggest challenges and rewards of serving in this role?
The biggest rewards are getting to meet my constituents and talk to them. And I'm in the minority as a Democrat currently in the legislature. So one of the biggest challenges is that I don't have a lot of levers that I can pull in terms of power. The power balance is very difficult right now because the makeup of the legislature is 91 Republicans and 9 Democrats. So just procedurally, we don't have a lot of maneuver. So most of the things that I want to get through, it's just not going to happen because of the makeup of the legislature. And so I spend most of my time playing defense. But some of the difficulties are talking to some of my constituents and them having very, very real problems that aren't partisan problems. Like most of the time when people hear about the government, you see the big splashy headlines. And yes, those are important, but most of what we do is actually really boring and like stuff we all agree on. And the fact that it can often be so hard to solve problems that have easy solutions. A lot of them don't have easy solutions, but a lot of them do. And not being able to solve those problems is always the most difficult thing. We also don't work very much every year. The legislature is only in session for 60 days a year. So then the rest of the year, when I find out about all of these problems, there's nothing we can do about it for the most part.
So it's not like a monthly meeting that you guys have. It's just 60 full days, or how does that
No.
work?
60 calendar days. So like that counts Saturdays and Sundays. And we don't work on those days. Sometimes we go in on Saturdays, but we're not allowed to work on Sundays. And so 60 calendar days every year. It's typically the second Wednesday in January and 60 days onto that. And then after there's a new governor, it starts in February because we got to get them inaugurated and get in. So this year's like our warm session. So we'll start in the middle of February and go to the middle of April. But yeah, we only have 60 days to make the law unless we have a special session. And so it's hard. We have monthly meetings called interim meetings, but that's typically like an educational experience where we have different agencies or different organizations come in and teach us about stuff, but we can't change the law at that time. So we really have to kind of have our acts together to get everything done during those 60 days, and they go fast.
It doesn't leave you a lot of time for anything.
Yeah, it's really hard. And you have to get, at that time, you have to get stuff through. Most bills have to go through one or two committees in the House and then on the floor of the House, which is 3 whole days, and then get over to the Senate, which is another day. And then it has to go through that whole other 3 whole days in the Senate. You got to work quick. But most of the issues are like very, very important things that we need to address. So we need to, take time to deliberate them. And unfortunately, we just don't have time. And it would require changing the Constitution to be able to lengthen the session. And nobody really wants to do that because that's a lot more money taxpayers have to pay. So it's kind of a cluster in that terms.
What are the issues that you're most passionate about?
I'm kind of all over the place. I've never said there's really like one thing that I work on. I kind of ended up becoming the person that people go to for some things. And those things include nuclear energy, childcare, and then it kind of changes. Like one of the bills that I worked on was banning child marriage, and we got it partially banned. But I'm kind of all over the place. I'm really interested in all kinds of policies. So I find interest in most of it, really, but there's not like one thing that's like, this is my thing. I kind of hop around.
Could you walk us through how a bill becomes law in our state?
Yeah. So in West Virginia, a bill is introduced by a delegate or a senator, and most of us aren't lawyers. We have access to lawyers. So there's a lot of different ways bills can be drafted, and it's either the member and their attorney draft them themselves, which is like you have to find the place in the code where the bill fits. Or we have a bill drafting office. Like I can send ideas, like let's say Wyoming had a great piece of legislation. I can send Wyoming's legislation to our attorneys and say, I would love to do this in West Virginia. And then they use their legalese to write it into the code for me and create the bill. So that's how we get the bills drafted. And then they get introduced. I'm in the House. But the process is the same in the Senate. I'm in the House. And so the bill comes up from bill drafting. The Speaker of the House decides what committee or committees it needs to go to. Then it goes to those committees, and let's say it's the health committee because we're dealing with IDD waiver. So if we're dealing with IDD waiver, then the bill goes to the health committee. Then me as a member, I have to go to the chair of the health committee and say, please run this bill. I beg you, run this bill. And they have full discretion over what bills they want to run. They have total discretion. So lots of bills go to committee and just die. And you got to get the chair to agree to run the bill, no matter what party you're in or whoever. So then let's say they decide to run the bill. The bill will be in committee. We'll take testimony from the agencies or from the public, and they'll get to talk about the issue. We can amend the bill there, and then we'll vote on the bill in the committee. If the bill passes, then if it deals with money, it then goes to the finance committee to repeat the same process. If not, it'll go straight to the floor of the House. Bills have to be read on 3 separate days on the floor. The first day is just basically like, here's this bill. The second day is the day that we can amend the bill on the floor, and we have to get up and fight for our amendments and vote on them. And that's typically a voice vote, not a recorded vote where we press our yes or no button. We literally sit there and yell, yay or nay. It's very old school in that way, but it's like literally who can be louder. And so you like yell yay or nay. And then if you don't know, they're like, oh, this one was close or not close. Then you can do something called division, where we raise our hands and somebody counts, or we can do a roll call where we press our buttons. So that's on amendment day. And then day 3 is where we get up and discuss the bill and then do the actual vote. So 3 days. Then if it passes, it goes to the Senate, repeats that whole entire process. And then if it's passed, then it goes down to the governor to be signed. And so there's a lot of steps from getting a bill to be a law. And things can get held up at any point along the way, and they often do.
What are some of the misconceptions that people typically have about the legislative process?
Oh, about the process? I think often that people think that leadership is being nefarious and trying to make things really hard for people. And I don't think that that's always, sometimes that is the case, but more often than not, that is not the case. And typically, if there's issues, it is just because people didn't think of something. Like we're rewriting our rules right now, and the rules are what govern the legislature. And so, that's kind of says what we can do, whether we can get up and speak, whether people can come and do a public hearing, like that's all within the rules that we govern, and nobody else has say over them but us. Um, so I think a lot of times people think that they're being shady when they're in the rules, and most of the time that's not the case. We're just trying to find a process that like actually works and is mostly fair. I think the other big misconception, and it's not necessarily about the process, just in general, is that we all hate each other. Like if you're in one party, you don't like anybody on the other side, and that's simply not the case. I have very, very close friends that I don't agree with on almost anything, but we all are pretty much friends as people.
I think that would be a big misconception, at least from an audience member like myself, because if I'm just looking in, all they do is show the clips on the news of when things are the most heated or extravagant. So it does look like people are kind of yelling and they're very passionate about what they're trying to get passed or accomplish. So I could definitely see that point of view also. And I want to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the threat that was happening to the West Virginia IDD waiver, and the impact that it would have had on our community. Can you talk a little bit about that budget and what was being threatened at the time?
Yeah, so the West Virginia budget is done in a very weird process where the governor presents the budget, and then the House works on their version, the Senate works on their version. And at the very last of session, like the last couple days, they get together. This process, I think, is crazy, by the way. They get together and decide, okay, here's what we're going to do. Like they spend all their times on their own documents, and they don't have any conversations about those until, which is a waste of time. And then at the very end, they get together and are like, okay, here's what we're actually going to do. And we have no clue until literally the last day of session. So like we sent over, the House did their budget first. They typically decide who's going to do it first. The House did their budget first. They get up, they present the budget. It takes like an hour for them to explain it to us on the floor, because it's like 2 or 3 inches thick. It is $5 billion that we're talking about. And so we have to go through line by line of what department gets what amount of money. It's a lot of work. And so we passed our budget. We felt good about it. The budget got to the Senate. This is on the last day of session. And the Senate inserted their version into our version, which was vastly different in the terms that it cut 10% of the Department of Human Services budget completely and gutted the IDD waiver program. And it would have cut a ton of funding from IDD. They did cut a ton of funding from IDD waiver. And then they had to go back in a special session and kind of fix it. But like, I'm still not fully happy with the fix either. So it was kind of like a very last minute move that they did because they were like, well, we don't think that these programs are being run very well. So we're just going to take away a bunch of their money and see what happens. And you should never, ever do that. You should never, ever just like stop funding on something and see what happens. Like, I understand wanting to do an audit or wanting to make it work better. Like, that's totally reasonable. But to just be like, we're just going to see what happens when we're talking about people's livelihood is not, it really creates a lot of unrest and a lot of uncertainty for families that rely on these programs. And I guess I can never understand why they thought that that was okay to do to people. We've seen it at the federal level, this month in January of 2025, where money people are relying on and have been receiving for a long time is now just a big question mark, and it's scary, and it shouldn't even be a partisan political issue.
Unfortunately, I know firsthand what that would be like. We are a family that West Virginia waiver is our lifeline. I know when we went to the
Yeah.
rally, the echo was please don't cut our lifeline. And because families like mine rely so heavily on it, not just for the Medicaid that it comes with, but also for that respite care and that
Yeah.
mental health and well-being that really goes back to the basis of our entire nonprofit. And without that waiver, most of us would have a really, really difficult time, more than we already have. What would that have meant for that program if the funding wouldn't have been available?
I guess there's two options. They could have either just like run it as is until the money ran out, and who knows when that would have been, right? Or they could start to scale back their services and cut eligibility or kicked people, not accepted anybody new. We've already got I think we have a wait list right now of, I believe it's over
Over a
500
thousand.
people. It might be 1,000 at this point. Yeah, we don't cut that number very frequently because a lot of people don't come off of it. And so for us to get the people off the list means that we have to increase the funding. Like, that's the only way to do it because people aren't coming
Right.
off of it very, very frequently. And these are people that we're charged with the care of. Like, this is our job. And so they could either cut the eligibility and make less people eligible, or they could continue services and then they'd cut off for everybody at some point, which is like kind of the route that they took. They made that extra fund of money that can be used. So what they ended up doing was going into a special session and appropriating like $140 million into an excess fund. And they said, when you run out of money, you can use this money. However, you have to use it by the end of quarter 3. Well, who budgets for something to run out 3/4 of the way? What's going to happen is they're not going to use that money because they wouldn't have had to have used it by that point in time. They would have needed it after then. And so then the legislature is going to come back in this year in February and say, why haven't you used that money? And they won't have used it because they wouldn't have needed it at that point. It's kind of like it's almost like a trap. And so they're going to
Right.
be like, well, you don't actually need that money. So I'm really like, that was really bad how all of that happened. But I'm kind of scared for what's to come, really, because we're now going to be in this kind of catch-22 where they're going to be like, you didn't use that pot of money that we gave you, knowing that when it was set up, nobody was ever going to touch it. So I worry about what happens for this next year's budget, especially because we're expecting a shortfall in the budget.
As a family on waiver, I can speak for why that budget is so difficult for us to use. When it comes to respite care,
Yeah.
finding care for our children at the rate that they have set us
Hmm.
at is next to impossible. So, at the
Yeah.
bare bones minimum wage rate, is very difficult to find support for the highest support needed children or
Right.
adults. And with this waiver program, it's set up to where it's supposed to be for the life of the child, which is
Yeah.
great. But along with that comes a lot of hurdles. The second thing is trying to find the providers, and not to mention that we are the last in the nation for resources in the disability community. We're last for
Hmm.
funding, but we are one of the highest populated states for the disability community.
Yeah.
So those two things don't match. So for a parent like myself, yes, the waiver program will allow my son certain benefits and certain therapies, but I can't find an occupational or speech therapist that will accept waiver. So I can't use my
Yeah.
waiver budget and my funding to actually get him the care. So although in hindsight, I would love for this program to fund the things that my son needs, but it can't. It physically
Yeah.
can't. Is there a way for them to fix the program that would be more accessible since we have such a lack of providers accepting Medicaid?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways. I think there is increasing the rates, right? Like paying people more to do the services. And yes, that's going to cost more money, but what's the point of like you said, what's the point of having these services if they're at such criminally low rates that no one's going to take them? If they were at living wages, we could find people to do these jobs. Yeah, it's pay people more. The answer is almost always pay people more. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic in other sectors. I don't know why we don't just fully realize it. I do think there are some members of the legislature who their bread and butter is working in this field. There's two guys one who's the new chair of the health committee who works for one of these companies. Another guy, two of them work directly in this field every day. And I think they have a lot of answers because they see the ins and outs of it. And so I'm hopeful that there's things that we can do to fix it. And this has to be working well in some other states. I'm sure it isn't perfect anywhere, but there has to be way more opportunities that are available that we're not taking care of. I just don't get why when we look for places to cut, we look to hurting disabled people. That's what I don't understand, or families with disabilities. And those are our most vulnerable folks that I just don't get it.
Oh, and when we went to the Capitol last year, you were one of the most passionate and outspoken representatives about this topic. What made it so personal for you that you were able to be such a strong voice?
Honestly, I don't super have a personal connection to it. I just think it's the right thing to do, right? I care about everybody all the time, and that means caring about everybody all the time. I care about it just because it's correct and it's right to care for. I care about my kids. I care about everybody's kids. It's my job.
Again, we thank you because you were such a strong voice. Your educational videos were tremendously helpful on TikTok and your other social media platforms. So, going back to when that budget was in crisis and potentially going to be cut, what are some of the ways that, as a community member, we can get involved to try to impact legislature?
I think the first thing that we should all always do is know our own rights. And that includes also knowing how the legislature works. And typically, like you said, your son's diagnosis turned your life upside down and you never knew any of this ahead of time. You don't learn how state government works anymore. Our civics education for everyone is very low. And typically people have to get a crash course in civics whenever something bad happens to them or something confusing happens to them. And then they feel stupid for not knowing these things. And there's a very large barrier to entry to understand this. And there's no real way to learn. There's not good ways to learn. You can go on the legislature website and learn how a bill becomes a law, but like that's only going to take you so far and not going to tell you how to figure this stuff out. You have to just learn it. And so that's what I try to do with my videos is just kind of teach people how things work in a low barrier to entry way, just so they don't feel kind of afraid of the government. Because in all actuality, government should just work. It should just work. We all shouldn't have to deal with it as much as we do. And our lives shouldn't hinge on what the government is doing, whether it be state or federal. But that's kind of where we are right now. And we have to find trusted resources to get information from. That's another place. That's another thing that's really scary is that like it's getting harder and harder to know what's believable because of just kind of what's out there and knowing what sources you can trust and who you can trust. Like, I know there's a lot of people who just aren't going to trust me because I'm an elected official. And I fully understand that. That's totally reasonable, but like I'm hopeful that I try to come from a place of teaching people things and just being factual versus well, here's why this should happen and only giving my side of an argument. I if I'm doing that, I just say, well, here's why we're doing this and here's what the other side has to say about it. But more than anything, I just want people to understand the process and how they can get engaged. So I think the number one thing is kind of knowing how the process works, knowing who your own elected officials are, and you can do that on the West Virginia Legislature website. Find out what districts you're in and then who your legislators are. And all of our contact information's on there. Most people's cell phones are on there. If not, there's legislative phone numbers or there's email addresses. And like being comfortable with reaching out to your representatives, or if maybe your representative doesn't agree with you, find one that does and reach out to them. I serve my district of 20,000 people, but I deal with people from all over the state because they feel more comfortable coming to me, and that's okay too. But yeah, just knowing that I think a very important thing is knowing that we're just regular people and that we're accessible. We're all very accessible.
What about effective communication? When we talk about the impact that IDD waiver was going to have, I know for my family specifically, obviously that was going to impact us a ton. And being as we have this nonprofit now with many
Mhm.
members that are also on waiver, what type of effective communication should we have when crisis like this happen? What's the best way? What's the first step that we need to take to really be heard?
That's like my favorite question, I think, because effective communication is incredibly important. And I think that there's not one answer, right? I do think it's like knowing that there's always a potential for a crisis like this or any type of crisis to kind of be swept under the rug. So kind of having a plan where everyone can easily mobilize, whether that be have all of our email addresses in a Google Doc so you can send them out to your members to copy and paste them. Lots of groups do form letters. I don't find those to be as moving. I get why they do them, but I would much rather hear people's personal stories. But there are several organizations where I will wake up one day and have over 400 emails from the same organization, and every single one says the exact same thing. And that is a strategy, and that does move the needle sometimes, but sometimes it's counterproductive, right? Because people are just like, "Oh my God, I'm so sick of all these emails. Yikes, I can't find anything because of all these emails." But I think effective communication can go a couple ways, and it also depends on who you're talking to. Like if you're talking to the chair of the finance committee, you need to have data. They don't care about your anecdotes. They want to know numbers. Versus sometimes there are some legislators where anecdotes are better and they do want to hear your personal experience. I think either way, effective communication means at the core, understanding that we're real people and treating us as such, not just like really mean emails. Sometimes I get a whole bunch of really, really mean emails, and I'm like, oh, you're just mad. And they might be mad at something very legitimate, but it's like, if you're just yelling at me, I don't care what side you're on. I don't, who wants that? So I think being nice is the first step. I think having some data points and having a couple talking points that everyone can repeat is very effective. And being able to back up the numbers, like if you have a data point, we'll want to know where did that come from, because who knows where it came from. It could be, who knows? It could be incorrect. Who knows? So I think having data points is helpful. But also, when you call your legislator, tell them your zip code, tell them where you live. So then they know you're that they're responsible for you. So I do think it's important to call and email your legislators, though. If you call them, it's typically a capital office number. The odds of the legislator being there to answer the phone are slim to none. So you'll probably end up leaving a voicemail. So I think we all have the email on our phone. To me, that's the easiest to do. And yeah, absolutely include your personal stories. And I would say you can make them as long as you want, but if you can get it across pretty quickly, that's probably easier. It's like I would love where you're from, then your story, and then your ask. You got to have an ask or a
Okay.
call to
Yeah.
action.
That's perfect advice. I think when we look at these issues, when they come up, everyone is so overwhelmed. We know that we're upset about the cause, but we have no idea
Yeah.
how to fix it. And then you have a lot of people that will just be too embarrassed to call unless they have some type of script or plan to go off of. I think the biggest thing that I would stress to people is let's, like you said, have a personal story, have your points that you'd like to speak about, and try to educate yourself as much as possible so you're not just going in and making sure that we realize on the other end that we start with grace and we end with grace, because no one's out
Yeah.
to get us, and we're just trying to all get on the same page. How can our listeners stay informed and engaged with your work?
The easiest way is to follow me on social media on every single platform. I'm not on Blue Sky, but I think I'm on every platform other than that. And it's Kayla Young for WVFOR spelled out. And everything is on there. But I think also following your own legislators is good. I think paying attention to the news is good and a variety of sources. I really love Metro News and Stephen Allen Adams with Ogden Papers and Amelia at West Virginia Watch. It's hard to keep up with and it's exhausting. And everybody needs, some mental health breaks from the news. But if we're not informed, then we can't do anything about it. So I think it's helpful to stay up to date on things. I even have Google for issues that I care about. I have Google Alerts set up. So then if like you could set up a Google alert that's like WV and IDD waiver, and then anytime it's mentioned in the news, you'll get an email about it. So you don't have to go out looking for it. Like I try to automate my life as much as possible to stay up to date on stuff. And then it's like, then it's in my email and I can check it if I want to, but I don't have to if I don't want to. So then it's kind of more at your own pace.
Yeah, that's perfect advice. I love that. Thank you. And is there anything else that you would want to share with our audience?
I think just that I want the legislature to be very accessible to people. And even if you are mad at us, and even if you're worried you're going to sound not smart, come anyways and talk to us anyways. Like we are there to serve people, and the building is open to the public all the time. You can watch the legislature every single day on YouTube. It's on the website. The committee schedules are on there. You can watch it, you can read about it, but I think just staying involved is very important. And we need more great people running for office. I don't care what party they're in, but like we need more lived experience and we really need more moms. Last year, I was the only mom with kids under the age of 18 in the entire West Virginia House of Delegates. One out of 100 people. And so I want more moms running for office.
How many women make up the delegates?
This year we have there's 13 including the Senate. So I think there's maybe 8 in the House, 8 or 9. It's the lowest number in the entire country of women.
That's
And we see when like Nevada and New Mexico, Nevada was the first state to have a majority women. So they have like 60 out of 100. And we see so much more legislation relating to protecting women and, considering women when there's more women in the legislature. So if you have your lived experience in there and everyone has lived experience about a variety of topics, again, there's no qualifications. You have to live in a district and you got to be 18 to run for office. That's it. So we need more moms.
How many times can you run?
As many as you want.
Oh,
It's a
there's no
2-year
limit.
term. There's no limit. It's a 2-year term. We do not have term limits at all. The pay is terrible. It's $22,000 a year. But it's a part-time job and it's not really a part-time job. It ends up being a full-time job. But we're trying to make it this year. We're trying to make it a lot more accessible for parents who are in the legislature. There's a new dad in the legislature, and he missed a lot of votes last year because his wife was pregnant and she was ill, and so he had to be in Morgantown a lot. And so we're trying to work on remote voting and some different things that just make it easier for more people to do the work.
Thank you for everything that you are doing, not just for our community, but for the state of West Virginia. Everything is so impactful, and I really appreciate you sharing the knowledge that you did with us today. And I know so many other people are going to appreciate it as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and I try to help everybody that I can.
No, it definitely shows. I thank you. I'm
Thank
excited
you.
to keep following you too.
Thank you, ma'am. Should be an interesting session.
Thank you so much for listening. If you would like more information about our mission or upcoming events and trainings, you can visit our website at www.unpuzzledparentsconnect.com or follow us on Facebook.